Yeah. So there's a lot of interesting things that happened over the past week from a tech perspective, but we're going to start with some of the enterprise IT stalwarts. This was definitely has been a big week from an earnings perspective for some of the big companies in tech, such as IBM, SAP, ServiceNow. And we're going to dive into those just really quickly, each one. First of all, IBM, obviously a longtime stalwart in the IT space, has been making some noise recently around agentic AI, as well as getting some of its story around figuring out how to talk about tech enabled consulting and AI enabled consulting to a greater degree. And we're starting to see that the change over to Arvind Krishna as CEO has really created some interesting results, and the market seems to like it so far.
Yeah, I think certainly positive. I've always been a fan of sorts, I guess, of IBM. I mean, certainly I have just any of us who sort of grew up in the IBM era, you just sort of, I always root for them to continue to find ways to be relevant. And they are a company that has a long history of reinvention. And I think this is another one of those stories. I think, we're going to talk about SAP here in a second. I think that they are largely in the category of SAP, that the bulk of their revenue is still being driven by the sort of legacy run rate business that is very difficult to unseat. And so that's a huge chunk of it. It is interesting to see them make some headway in AI. And you mentioned that Arvind Krishna is a huge part of that. I honestly have not been following IBM very carefully, and so when I was reading this article, it's like, oh gosh, I forgot I know him. I mean, not like I know him, but I've met with him and talked to him several times. And to your point, he is sharp as a tack, very technical, and I think that's exactly what IBM needs, particularly at this moment, because the thing we sometimes forget is AI is actually a very technical domain and it's very complicated. And so you need to do that. I think IBM still has a lot of issues with their M&A strategy. They've got this disjointed collection of companies they've acquired and quasi rebranded. And I think they have all the building blocks to be a massive player. And I'm hopeful that this is a sign for them to sort of shift that, because I think they can have a lot of impact in the industry around it. But so this was really solid news for them.
Yes, one of the things that IBM has definitely struggled with in the past is getting a lot of great acquisitions, market-leading acquisitions that everybody would have said was a great idea from a pure synergy perspective, and then kind of making the messaging very mushy by turning everything into a broad-based data solution or a technology management solution in a way that loses some of the momentum and loses some of the nuance of having best in class acquisitions and technologies come into the IBM fold. So hopefully they will be able to maintain some of that nuance and some of that progress going forward with the acquisitions they're making, especially in the software space, and to keep letting Red Hat be Red Hat.
Yeah, that maybe is one of the big wins and I was actually very skeptical of that in the beginning, and it sort of turned into the tail that wags the dog. And so I think that's good. Talking about the other sort of big behemoth in this, because we'll talk about ServiceNow, but I think ServiceNow is in a different category here.
Mm-hmm.
SAP, another one of these companies, also like IBM and like Oracle and these guys, that it's just a massive run rate business that sort of is the ship that you can't stop. But what we've been watching with all of these companies very carefully is, are they innovating? Are they figuring out how to not just have this sort of long, slow death, but actually finding a way to remain relevant? SAP in particular, I think, has struggled. I mean, when Bill McDermott was there was a lot of really solid momentum, but none of it
Mm-hmm.
really ever landed. It sounded great and everyone sort of responded positively, but it never really landed. But their earnings report this year seems to show some signs that maybe finally it's the tide is shifting a little bit. I still struggle with seeing that they are actually like, we are not talking about them for the most part in the AI world or any of the things that are sort of occupying the mind. But I do think they are doing a good job of finding continued relevance within their core sweet spot, which for them, it's really about reducing churn, making sure that they aren't losing customers and pissing them off so much that they are willing to make a change. It doesn't hurt that there aren't a lot of options, but yeah, I mean, what was your take on the earnings report?
Yeah, I thought the most important part around SAP is that they are finally starting to make some headway in converting customers to the cloud and trying to figure out how to keep them in the fold from that perspective going forward, and to have them being simply have customers who are upgrading to the most recent version of SAP on an ongoing basis, rather than simply using their old 10-year-old highly customized version that they can never change or move from again. Because once you have that fixed version of your ERP, you can't modernize. You go down this hole of extremely customized support. You start looking at third-party support options, all these things that get you away from pure SAP, and frankly, the revenue that comes along with having a loyal customer across the board. So it's interesting to see from that perspective. I agree that from a product perspective, it is hard to tell where SAP is best in breed at this point. That doesn't get emphasized as much because SAP is so focused on the big picture that, as I just said with IBM a little while ago, I think that is one of SAP's challenges, that if you want to be the solution for everything across the board in the company, you have to show how you are keeping up with everybody else. And there's a lot of competition right now in the SaaS world.
Yeah, but I think we're also seeing this momentum, or this shift, I guess, in momentum, where enterprises are focusing on these major platforms and they're sort of consolidating their investments, and that is nothing but upside for SAP. And remember, SAP went through a whole bunch of leadership turmoil, and it doesn't seem to have had a major impact. So, good for them on that front.
Yes, much
The
like
other major financial,
Salesforce.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Well, I mean, I think it's, you see these groups, they're all sort of in the same boat. Whereas, as long as they're not really screwing up, they're in really solid position. And trying to get into that same that illustrious group, I guess, of companies that sort of fall into that category of ServiceNow. They reported their earnings, which I think is fascinating because they beat expectations. They beat their, what do you call it, their guidance.
Yeah.
They beat their
Guidance.
guidance. And yet the stock, because they didn't beat it by as much as people wanted them to, the stock still took a beating. I think it's rebounded now. It's just, I mean, this is a stock market thing, and it just speaks to the ridiculousness of it, because if you look at their actual numbers, they're staggering. I mean, they've now grown. I mean, Bill McDermott has done an amazing job of truly accelerating the growth of a company that was already fairly large, but they're now looking at a run rate of about $12 billion. And hitting, massive numbers. I mean, the number in their summary here that was striking to me was nearly 500 customers with more than 5 million in ACV. Now, I did find it interesting they're saying ACV versus ARR, but regardless, that's still a massive number, and that represents approximately 20% of their business coming from these super big organizations. And again, putting on the fact that, bear in mind that we now compete with them on some degree, I think that's one of their weaknesses. If you are not a massive company, they're very clearly skewing to that sort of focus. But it's hard to argue with the performance. It is pretty remarkable.
Yes, and the fact that ServiceNow is continuing to expand its functional capabilities, which we're about to talk about. Most notably, ServiceNow has been making splashes over the past week about now being in CRM, and being able to start handling enterprise application capabilities, whereas it has traditionally been seen as a workflow player. And this comes at a time when the CRM market is in a bit of flux because everything seems a little long in the tooth. There have definitely been some progress made by companies like HubSpot getting into the CRM market and dealing with modern needs and use cases where the likes of Salesforce and Oracle and SAP aren't quite as excited to either innovate or make things simpler for the end user at this point.